Good morning, everybody. As we're getting started here, we'd love to hear from you in the chat box. Let us know where you're coming from. It's exciting because I know we'll have people from all over the world. It's been an exciting fall, this series. I'm very excited as to the direction it's taken us. Anyway, if you just want to let us know in the chat where you're from, it's great to hear from you. I will go ahead and get started with the formal introduction. My name is Pia De Saleni, and I am the President and Executive Director for the Global Institute of Church Management. We support our flagship program in Rome, the Program of Church Management, which was started at the behest of the Vatican. And we are in our fourth episode of our current series of managing the church's assets. And for those of you who've been able to join us, you'll know that we've been focusing on real estate with an eye to a real estate conference in February. We've been partnering with the Fitzgerald Institute for Real Estate at Notre Dame. So because of the COVID concerns, unfortunately, we've had to postpone that conference. I think we are locking in on some dates in April. So tentatively, I'll just say tentatively, we're looking at 28th through the 30th, and we hope to be able to confirm that. But you can register for more information at gicm.org, and we'll keep you updated. We, in the meantime, want to also let you know that we'll be doing a session of executive and intensive courses from January 31st to February 4th. And again, we'll be circulating information on that, and that will be in Rome. And I'm just very grateful today that we're looking at this topic of legal legacies. It's very complex. Frankly, it's outside of my wheelhouse. So I'm very grateful to be having Dan Kelly join us. Dan is an attorney in the law faculty at Notre Dame. He specializes in real estate, wills, and trust. He is also the director of FIRE, the Fitzgerald Institute for Real Estate. So we've been working together these past few months just to plan these different, not only the webinars, but the upcoming conference. There's a great synergy because many of our students are daily faced with the challenges, or will be faced with the challenges of how to manage the church's real estate. And again, our motto is that we're teaching people best practices so as to steward the assets of the church for the salvation of souls. We want to make sure that everything that the church has is properly used. And so with that, I'd like to, I'll turn it over to Dan in just a minute. I want to remind everybody of our format. So the panel will go for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A. You'll see in the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A option. It's off to the right, just before the leave button. Don't leave. Just submit your questions on the Q&A, and in the chat, just let us know who you are and where you're coming from. Again, it's great to hear from you. And with that, I will turn it over to Dan. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you, Pia, and thanks so much for having us. As Pia said, I'm a professor of law and the director of the Fitzgerald Institute for Real Estate at Notre Dame. And the Global Institute for Church Management has been a superb partner with us and for us over the last few months. And the webinars so far this fall have been excellent. We're looking forward to the conference in Rome this spring. And we at the Fitzgerald Institute have launched a specific initiative focused on church properties led by our program director, David Murphy, who's been on the earlier calls. So I highly encourage all of you who are interested in this question of church real estate to continue to reach out to David and to me, because we think there is a huge need within the church to focus on these issues of real estate. And as Pia said, all for the furthering the mission of the church. So luckily today we have a panel of three experts in this area. So I'd like to introduce each of them briefly, and then we'll jump into our questions and discussion. And we look forward to all of your questions at the end of today's call. So first up is Professor Nicole Stelle Garnett. She is my colleague at the University of Notre Dame, where she is the John P. Murphy Foundation Professor of Law. She is a graduate of Stanford University and Yale Law School, and she went on to clerk on the U.S. Supreme Court for Justice Clarence Thomas and worked as a public interest attorney in Washington, D.C. Her research focuses on property law, land use, and education policy, including books that she's published with Yale University Press on land use and urbanism, and the University of Chicago Press on Catholic schools and urban neighborhoods. At Notre Dame, in addition to her primary appointment at the law school, she also serves as a fellow at the Institute for Educational Initiatives, the Kellogg Institute for International Studies, the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, and the Fitzgerald Institute for Real Estate. She's a senior policy advisor for the Alliance for Catholic Education, a program engaged in a wide array of efforts to strengthen and sustain Catholic schools. Next up is Father Pat Reedy Csc. Father Pat is an ordained Roman Catholic priest within the Congregation of Holy Cross. He is also a recent graduate of Yale Law School, where he earned his Juris Doctorate degree. At Yale, he served as an editor of the Yale Law Journal and Yale Journal on Regulation. He co-founded the Yale Free Exercise Clinic and published a note on condemning worship, religious liberty protections, and church takings. His research interests are at the intersection of religion and property. Before studying law at Yale, Father Pat served in residential ministry at the University of Notre Dame, where he offered chaplaincy support to campus ministry, Notre Dame Law School, and the Notre Dame boxing team. He holds undergraduate and graduate degrees from Notre Dame, and he currently serves as a law clerk for Judge Thomas Hardiman on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. Last but not least, Carlo dalla Vedova is a civil and canon lawyer based in Rome and a partner of the Italian firm Dalla Vedova Studio Legale. An expert in religious properties, Carlo is admitted before the ecclesiastic courts and the Studio Recali of the Supreme Court of the Rota Romana of the Holy See. He is a legal and institutional specialist to public entity and public international organizations and embassies in Rome, as well as an expert in church properties, having negotiated real estate deals for many religious congregations. He also specializes in criminal practice, having litigated in the Italian Supreme Court and in the European Court of Justice for the protection of human rights. Mr. Dalla Vedova has lectured throughout the world, and in 2017, Trinity College Law Society in Dublin, Ireland, honored his work in the protection of human rights. So all three panelists have a great variety of experiences and expertise in this issue. We also realize that real estate and the law is an issue that involves both canon law and civil law, and a lot of the issues are country specific. So we're going to do our best to both be general in terms of general takeaways that people should know, but also try to make some specific points and address your specific questions. So with that, let's jump to our first question, and let's just go around the horn. And if each of our panelists, starting with Carlo, could tell us about your general interest in real estate, law, and the church.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction. And of course, special thanks for the Global Institute of Church Management for having invited me in this important seminar. And also, I'm very pleased to share with my co-speaker today, and I hope we're going to have an interesting afternoon. The interest that I particularly have is a practical interest, meaning that as a lawyer, I'm not an academic. We deal in Rome with many issues related to the management of church property, which has totally, I think, went through a change in the last 10, 15 years. And therefore, in view of some of the issues that each congregation, each ecclesiastic entity has inside, especially when there's property available or there's decision to change the destination, or the last decision is to sell some of the property, we have been directly involved. In some of the cases, we've been reviewing the society, the international society of a specific congregation with perhaps, in one case, we had 32 provinces around the world, in order also to coordinate with the other consultant, with the other superior generals, with the general chapter, and making opinion on each specific position, especially here in Italy, in reality, giving legal opinion, not only on the legality of the real estate in terms of having the correct title, to make sure that there's no liens, there's no surprise, no problems, especially from the license point of view. We also have a specific expertise in the fine arts liens, because of course, most of the property here in Italy and in Rome in particular, where I live and work, they do have a lien from historical authority here, the fine arts. We also have a special code Italy has approved. So our expertise being international, but also canon lawyer, because this is one of the things I did in my life, has been extremely focused in the last year in providing legal services and opinion on also the coordination between national, domestic, in this case, civil Italian law and canon law. And one of the things I want to say in the opening, I'm sure somebody else will comment, canon law applies all over the world. And so it's very difficult to make a general statement sometimes, because then you have to coordinate with the domestic national law from the Isle of Tonga in the Pacific to, I know, Kampala, Uganda, Spain, in Africa, or in America in the desert of New York. It's always canon law. The church defined herself, and this is one of the beauty of, for me, working in this sector, is universal. I like this world, which is more than global, and it's even more than international. We do some work also for UN agency here, which are defined international organization composed by state. But the church is actually universal. So keeping this in mind, we need to at least remember to our clients, to our advisors also sometimes, which are the main global universal principle of the church. And then of course, specifically adapt to the single situation in each nation. So this is my interest, and this is why I like to work in this sector.
Great, Carlo. Love having the practical side. Nicole?
Thanks, Dan. This is, and thanks to all of you for hosting this really important and interesting event. So I'm my interest, my background is both in education and in property law. I teach property law, I've written about property law. And I first got interested in church assets and church real estate through working with Catholic schools in the United States, and seeing that sometimes when Catholic schools were closed, it just started anecdotally. I thought, you know, maybe the church wasn't making the best decisions about how to reallocate those assets. They might be, I don't know, giving them away to a competitor. But so I got interested in this idea about, could we think through policies? A lot of places in the United States, for different reasons, Catholic schools have closed, unfortunately. Could we come up with some really wise policies that would help the church think about these important assets and what to do with them if they no longer are needed for the current purpose, which is educating children? And I actually ran into canon law, but I kept being told, well, canon law this and canon law that, and I didn't really understand that because I'm not a canonist. But so I sort of started becoming very interested in this question through my work with Catholic schools. But I'm also just really excited that Notre Dame itself, the university, has committed itself to this particular space. Certainly the church's assets in the United States and around the world are an issue that deserves wise counsel. I'm so glad to know of Carlo's good work. And I think universities can make a real difference in providing wise counsel to the church about its assets. What to do with this assets. I mean, in the United States, we have this very interesting situation where, you know, obviously we're a secularizing culture, and there, perhaps in some places, it feels like the church is shrinking, or the demographic footprint has shifted. So we have a lot of empty buildings, and we need to figure out what to do with them. We need to make decisions about how to repurpose them, or whether to sell them, whether to lease them. And I think helping think through what the wise policies are that are informed by canon law as well as civil law are really important. And in other places in the United States and in the world, the church is growing, and we don't have enough property, and we need to think through making decisions about how to acquire the property that we need to serve the evangelizing function of the growing church. There are far more Catholics in Texas than there are schools to serve them in the church, just to give one example. And so I think this is what's really exciting to me about this work in particular, is because I think it's an opportunity to help the church to really serve the function of using the gifts that we've been given, including property, to advance the evangelizing mission of the church. And doing so takes thinking up front. And I'm glad to be a part of the Fitzgerald Institute for Real Estate, which is committed to helping the church with that thinking up front. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Nicole. Father Pat.
Thanks, Dan. It's a real privilege and joy to be a part of this conversation. Echoing Nicole and Carlo, my interest in these issues and questions are sort of threefold: pastoral, theoretical, and practical, like Carlo. I count as my first parish as a priest a residence hall at Notre Dame. All of our dorms at Notre Dame have chapels within them. And so I was the rector, which meant that I was the kind of hall director administrator, but I was also the pastor of the parish, and Our Lady of Guadalupe Chapel was where our 275 mostly good, sometimes mischievous young men prayed. That for me has shaped the way I think about church property, because our church owns and uses, prays in, teaches in so much more than just houses of worship. And in many cases, we use structures in lots of different ways to carry about the church's evangelizing, catechetical, salvific mission. And so for me, these questions of real estate are first and foremost questions of pastoral care, how we can use structures to be able to minister to the people of God. Theoretically, as a sort of latent life legal vocation, the questions involved at the intersection of property and law and religion are really interesting. Western property law, Anglo-American property law, doesn't typically consider issues of subjective value. So we don't really think about why somebody might value a property, what they might consider it valuable for. We just sort of look at how much it costs, how much it could be resold for. And yet when we talk about a house of worship or a cemetery or a school, though the value involved in it for people of faith is tremendous. And the value of the property for the Catholic Church is so much more than just what we might resell it for. And so that's been a really interesting question for me to engage in some early scholarship. And finally, practically, like Carlo, I grew up in a part of Denver where the church had shifted demographically, and there was a lot of property where the Italian Catholic community used to live that wasn't really being used. And I watched old parishes used as weather safety shelters. I watched them used as gathering points for foster care ministry, places where the Eucharist had been celebrated, but a continuation of the church's social mission, seeing the person of Jesus Christ in the poor rather than strictly in the Blessed Sacrament. That for me as a young child formed the way I think about spaces. And so I think it's practically important in a lot of parts of the world where we have a great deal of real estate to be able to think creatively about how the church uses that in a way that honors the requirements of canon law.
Great, thank you, Father Pat. Want to open the discussion to all three of you, and Carlo, maybe you can give us, Nicole and Father Pat both alluded to this, but can you give us, before we even jump into the specifically legal issues and legal legacies, can you give us your view on kind of the long historical view of how we should think about this issue that in some places, you know, the church is shrinking, in some places it's growing. And I know we have people from all over the world, all over the United States, all over the world. And our goal is to be a missionary church and to evangelize the good news everywhere, right? And so there's a lot of things happening in the global north, including Europe and North America, but there's a lot happening in the global south, in Africa, Asia, Australia. So how should we think about the long historical view, just so, you know, we don't get discouraged because we have too many, you know, abandoned or vacant properties, and other people who may be feeling overwhelmed about how to meet the demand? How should we think about this in a long historical view?
Well, thank you, Dan, for introducing this subject, because in fact, we are talking of a very peculiar organization which has a very long history. The church today is facing problems in some part of the world, but one of the things that we have to recognize and protect and preserve and conserve is that we have a history. Even the definition of the goods of the church coming from our main piece of legislation is talking about temporal goods. And this is defined as a temporal assignment. So it's something that today we have to use for what is today 2021 needs of that particular congregation, parish, archdiocese, or whatever, with also a future vision, because it's a fluctuation, and the history of the church is an example. There's good moments and bad moments. So there is a problem today in terms of of priests and nuns. There's very few vocations in some part of the world. And therefore, as mentioned, the decision of managing the property today has to be adapted to what we have today. With, I think personally, the idea of keeping the property. It's not only an obligation coming from canon law, and it's also in many of the constitution of all the church entity that we need to preserve. So the management and also the idea of selling the property, which is very often something that you hear, is the end, is the last decision that should be taken, and has to be duly motivated. It's also required by our constitution. So whoever is responsible in this moment has to take into consideration all the previous and possible alternative solution, which is sharing the property, change the destination, of course, have an income, therefore renting it out, or even to give it to another charity, because we also should never forget, and this is very important in Europe, the distinction between commercial activity and religious and cult, which also then follows into all the tax exemption and benefits that we can get. And the definition of what is religion is defined in very often many jurisdictions. But then, of course, this does not mean that the entity can also do a commercial. So we have a pilgrim house, perhaps, is within the religion and cult activity because we have been hosting pilgrims. But if we rent as a hotel, that becomes a commercial. And this applies to also school and hospital and other activity. So the goal, I think, today is very important, despite the problems, despite the empty spaces that have, is to implement a strategy, which could also be very financial minded, in order just to keep the property under a fund and see what other people are doing in terms of managing property. And the other last comments is that we need to harmonize the standard. The church is going through a big review all over the world. You in America, you are quite advanced. I really appreciate, very happy to see how you manage property. You keep an inventory, you have all the power. But in many other countries in the world, this is not happening. So there's a lot of work to be done. And so the compliance to the requirement in terms of transparency, auditing, and be able also to explain in order for the liability of the person, of the individual, the father, the bursar, the superior general, it's very important and need to be harmonized with the standard which is applicable to international organizations like UN, for example, or even a global company around the world. And this is, I think, is also something that we have to, together with the programs of the management that we are all working on, we have to implement in the next short-term years, the harmonization to the international standard of the management.
Great. Nicole or Father Pat, any follow-on comments?
Yeah, sure. The first comment I would say, Carlo, is you may overestimate the advancement of the United States on these matters. We are not, I mean, so some dioceses, archdioceses in particular, are actually pretty sophisticated. Many are not. Many chanceries are, skeletal operations, and the assets that the church has is one problem, but very often the way that even canon law encourages sort of local control of some of these important assets. So I think that we should take care. And one of the reasons I'm excited about this work is that I think we could do a lot better at managing our assets. Father Pat and I have a paper that I suppose we'll probably talk about in a bit, but we were able to talk to a couple of different church property managers. One, the person in charge of managing the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints assets in the United States. There's only one guy who does it. He's a great lawyer. He's really smart. And he saw, that's probably what we did. Like, we probably just had a guy like him who was sort of managing all the church's assets. And I had to say, well, no, actually, many dioceses don't even know what they own. Like, they don't know what their assets are. I mean, so this is not true in Chicago and probably not in the Archdiocese of New York, but it is probably true in many places where it's really unclear what the church's assets are. So it's really important to figure out, to do the hard work, to do the inventory as you suggest, to understand the civil and canon law rules governing our assets, but also to make policies in advance about what to do with them. I just want to push back a little bit on the idea that it's always the case that that selling is the last option. And in fact, we put that after giving away. So the church's assets in the United States and in the world is vast and diverse. And for example, and I'm worried that the church sometimes sells things with sort of a fire sale in particular in the United States, probably in Europe too, because of civil liability concerns. They just need the cash, and that's bad. But we have a lot of assets that we maybe could sell and use the money for other apostolates. For example, the Archdiocese of Chicago recently sold a surface parking lot in downtown Chicago for $110 million. And I'm sure it was really nice for the people who attended church it was next to the cathedral, to have a place to park on Sunday. But I think there are other priorities for that parking lot, and $110 million can go a long way to doing a lot of good. So I think we have assets that come into our church that are donated. Perhaps a parishioner gives a house that the church doesn't need. So we have to keep in mind the diversity of assets. I do think it's important to think about what different strategies, perhaps other than sale. Maybe long-term leases is a good option often. But if you have, let's just take something that's really in my wheelhouse. My area is education. Let's imagine you have a school that has to close. It's very sad when a Catholic school has to close. You could do one of two things. You could give it to a soup kitchen, or you could lease it or sell it to be repurposed let's say you're in the Diocese of Brooklyn, where these are very valuable. And you could take that money and give it to other Catholic schools and help them thrive and survive. So I think we have to think about all of those things. If we have there's an example, I think, of a convent that I read about in Beverly Hills. It's worth, I don't know, $50 million. Maybe we don't need to repurpose the convent in Beverly Hills. Maybe we could use that. We can sell it and let some rich person have it and take the money and do good work. So I think the really important thing is to be able to think up front about what we have and what is the best use for it, and whether or not sale should be on the list of many different options.
Father Pat, you had a quick follow-up?
Yeah, one thing in addition to what Nicole's saying that I think will probably tee up something for our later conversation about canon law that I'd love to hear Carlo's wisdom on. The structure of the church is such that while the Pope is supreme, each local bishop is the local ordinary of their diocese, and they, amongst many responsibilities, serve as the sort of primary interpreter of certain fairly limited canonical restrictions, prohibitions on how property is managed, sold, repurposed, and especially when it comes to houses of worship. The phrase that we'll talk about is that something can be sold or alienated for profane but not sordid use. That leaves a lot open to the imagination. And Nicole and I in our research have found that different dioceses just within the United States interpret that canon very, very differently, to the effect of having lots of different restrictions that they put in place when they alienate property. The fact that that isn't standardized and canonically may not be able to be standardized means that the church is facing a very different project when it comes to navigating its real estate transactions. And I think this is also something that we're really excited about with the Church Properties Initiative within FIRE, is to be able to help offer guidance to local ordinaries as they think about the intersection of canonical restrictions and practical sale of church property.
Great. So let's start to think. I was going to throw out a broad question about, well, why is law relevant in this space? Because it clearly is. But we'll get to some of the specific projects that Carlo, Nicole, and Father Pat have worked on. But since Father Pat talked about canon law, Carlo, maybe let's dive straight into the canon law principles, and you can either pick up on what Father Pat is saying or kind of maybe provide us a general overview, because there are a lot of people on the call. Not all of us, including myself, are experts in canon law. So maybe give us the lay of the land of what we should be thinking about on these universal principles of canon law.
Sure. Well, first of all, canon law, it's collected in a code, and the code is applicable worldwide to all the church entities. So, of course, then locally, we don't even follow the nation territory, for example, in Australia, but we have our diocese, which the diocese then is the territory that is delegated to manage the activity of the church in that specific place. In many places around the world, we have archdioceses because they are so wide, so big in terms of territory, that then you have the jurisdiction of the local ordinary. And then, as very correctly said, the hierarchy of the church is very well defined with the Holy Father, the spiritual representative, but also legally also represented the church, which is also a state. The Vatican State is a state fully recognized worldwide. But then the cardinal, the bishop, the priest, and the congregation, the entity, the private entity, the public entity are in all over the world in terms of the subjective entity. And the code is applicable to all of us, to the member of the church, no matter where they are, and in particular for what concerns the administration of the temporal assets, which again is a principle that we are a custodian on a temporally base, not indefinitive. And we have to achieve what are the aims and the scope of our particular mission, according to the charisma, according to our mission, and according also to the historical time. Because yes, as Nicole was mentioning, the education of the was one of the main activity all over the world, and now is suffering a crisis, the Catholic education. And this maybe come back, maybe has to be adjusted to a different kind of internationalization of the education, which is one of the things that happening all over the world. But canon law, as I said, then is giving the general principle on how to manage, to acquire, to administrative, and also the way we have to register, keep it. So the management responsibility, or whoever is in the position at that moment. So the legal representative, the bursar, the treasurer, the superior general, and so on. And this also is today has developed with also, I was saying before, the harmonization in the line of responsibility of the person. Therefore, it's very important to define who is acting on behalf of that entity in that jurisdiction. And then if the person has the power, and if the power are well defined. In the past, just a letter of appointment was used to say that Father Patrick Reedy was the legal representative of the church in that specific jurisdiction with the letter from the bishop or the superior general. Today, the letter of appointment has to be defined with exactly the power in terms of perhaps a cap in determining the ordinary and extraordinary. What are the power to go to court? What are the power to deal with the employment issue, power to sell property, and so on. So therefore, the general principles are there, but I think that then everything has to be adjusted. And the other important link legally are the constitution. Each entity of the ecclesiastic has its own rules, which are inspired by canon law. They are all very similar around the world. But again, it's a binding document that before taking any decision, are we complying with our constitution? Are we following the procedure? Did we ask all the canonic authorization? Because as we said, it's a hierarchy. And it's a good that it's a hierarchy because the superior will oversee what the subordinate is doing. And if you make a mistake, there will be a possibility to amend. And also for those who has to take a difficult decision, once you have a board, and once you have an approval, well, everybody feels more relaxed because the liability then is distributed among a number of people. So, and this was not done, I would say, years ago, and it's today instead a standard practice to act in order, as I said, mainly to divide the liability, at the same time to be transparent and be able to explain what we're doing, where we keep the money, what we did with that will, with the benefit that we are gaining from a donation. Because today, the church, sometimes with some speculation, I must say, is subject to critics or investigations. And one thing is when you have the investigation from the internal ecclesiastic entity because we have a superior or somebody's coming from Rome, from the generalate to check. Another thing is when we're dealing with a prosecutor, or when we're dealing in front of a judge, or when we're dealing in front of a tax inspection. We need to be able, following the general principle, to create all the right document, to create the transparency that is today required in order to protect our administration today. The main other things that I like to say is that there is a general principle that we need to keep the property among the church. So before taking a decision of disposing or the final decision of renting, we should look inside the church if it's possible to buy another entity that perhaps is going to take over my half of my convent that today is empty because the school has been closed. And this is something that has to be done in a very transparent way with communication, with a database sharing, in order to see if it's possible before taking any decision with perhaps with involving third parties, to see if we have some brother and sister among our organization that will be able, even if it's not going to be a commercial rent, even if we give a discount, but if we can together achieve what is the scope of the institution and the charisma of the mission of our activity, well, this again is something that is coming from canon law, is very often in our constitution, and it's something that has to be done before any decision. So I will leave any specific question if there is, because canon law is very broad and it's difficult to summarize everything.
Sure. Nicole and Father Pat, I'm interested both from a canon law perspective, but also maybe transitioning into the civil law questions. In your own research and work on the ground, how have you seen kind of these legal tools being used to help the church in her evangelizing and social mission? And do you have a specific example or case study? Nicole, maybe we'll start with you to kind of illustrate some of these legal principles.
Well, I was going to give this one to Father Pat.
Sure, Father Pat, go with you.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, first off, just as a kind of disclaimer that I think is probably helpful for people on the call who may not know, most of us priests get very little canon law education in seminary. So when you might imagine in this conversation that your local pastor knows exactly how to navigate the canonical questions involved in his parish, we're very thoroughly imbued with teachings regarding the sacraments, but everything else, canon law is huge. If you pull out the codex, it covers a lot of topics, and most of us are not really trained or equipped to deal with it. So we rely on people like Carlo and other canonists and scholars to help us think about the issues involved when it comes to real estate. A fun case study that Nicole and I have worked on is this surface parking lot outside of Holy Name Cathedral in Chicago. So Nicole alluded to this earlier. The Archdiocese had lots and lots of real estate developers interested in this surface parking lot. For those of you on the call who haven't been to Chicago, the downtown has lots of these surface parking lots outside of department stores, churches, you name it. And they're just big flat asphalt spaces. Other parts of the city that have been developed since then have parking underground. So I saw a question in the Q&A about where are people supposed to park. In most parts of the city, including Grant Park, Millennium Park, they've literally sunk huge parking garages underground to make sure that parking is still available. It's just not taking up the land space above ground. And a developer, I believe J.D. Pritzker Realty, ultimately won the bid for this surface parking lot to put what is going to be or currently is the second or third tallest building in the city of Chicago. This is where the Sears Tower is, friends. I guess it's now the Willis Tower. So like being a tall building in Chicago means something. The church was able to sell it because that surface area, literally just an asphalt parking lot, was valuable. The challenge of it was because it was something owned by the church saw it, or at least it managed to see it, whoever carried out the sale, as something that needed to be restricted canonically. So that canon that we mentioned earlier about how church property should only be alienated for profane but not sordid use. Technically, that canon has to do with houses of worship, so consecrated sacred spaces, a church where mass has been celebrated. But the church in the Archdiocese of Chicago interpreted that canon as applying to any property that was sold, including this parking lot. And so what you have in civil law is a covenant being a restriction on the future use of land, not just for the developer who purchased the parking lot for this building, but for any future owner of that property. There are a lot of other complicated technicalities that nobody needs to be bored with this morning. But if you look at the deed that transferred title to this parking lot, you'll see there is a 10-page litany of restrictions. Everything from you can't perform abortions on the property or worship Satan on the property, which for Catholics on the call, I hope makes sense. But then there are other sorts of restrictions like you can't have a pawn shop, or you can't have a restaurant where people are indecently dressed wearing such things as so-called hot pants. I don't even really know what that is. These restrictions are all in place because the Archdiocese of Chicago interpreted a canon law restriction about not using the property for sordid use and came up with, in civil law terms, a series of restrictions. Whether those restrictions are all necessary, whether they are helpful to protecting the sacrality, the sacred nature of the property, is an open question. And I think it's something that we're working on, but I want to kick it over to Nicole and hear her thoughts on it too.
So I think the example that and we found other examples of using what we would call in the United States covenants, deed restrictions, that basically allow the church to enforce certain restrictions on the property, even when it's no longer the owner. I'm sure other legal systems have this. They do raise this interesting question about the intersection of civil and canon law, which has to be different in different contexts. So I see some folks from Latin America here, and I've been doing some research with some people at the Pontifical University of Chile on education policy. One of the things that we've actually found, is that the rules governing church autonomy, the legal rules governing church autonomy is in the United States and Panama are very different. And also that the way that and we see this in the United States too, the way that the civil law intersects with canon law, even in how the church is permitted to organize its affairs and assets, can differ in the United States from state to state. So in some states, for example, the church is not allowed to own assets as corporations sole. Like the bishop can't own all the assets in Louisiana of a diocese. I actually think there are weird religious liberty implications of that, but leaving that aside, it means you have to find other ways to organize the assets that are consistent with canon law. And that may give pastors a lot of power against the bishop. If the pastor wants to, I don't know, sell the parking lot and the bishop doesn't, it's not, there could be disputes about who's in charge of the asset. In the United States, we've also seen interesting, unfortunately, interesting intersections between civil bankruptcy law and the way we organize our church assets. So dioceses that are organized corporations sold, and it becomes easier for civil creditors in a bankruptcy, in an insolvency proceeding to reach all of the assets. So some dioceses have said, we're not going to do this corporation sold thing anymore. We're going to change the way we organize our assets to try to protect them from civil litigants, as well as what the reorganization and insolvency proceeding. So these are all like incredibly complicated and complex intersections that I think every different state, every national, we call it nations, but in the United States, there are different states that would have different rules that would affect this, and civil law in other countries would intersect in interesting and really difficult ways with canon law. And that's something that I think FIRE can do a lot of work, but certainly someone like Carlo, knowing that you are out there with all this expertise is really great.
Great, thanks, Nicole. And just for the people on the call, FIRE stands for the Fitzgerald Institute for Real Estate. So we like that acronym because we're on fire with the Holy Spirit, but just don't want people to get confused about real estate and fires. And so we're getting closer to the Q&A, and I would encourage anyone with questions to drop them into the Q&A. But I wanted to ask Carlo, before we get to the Q&A, to tell us a little bit about, he worked on a very interesting project with the Pontifical Irish College that involved, I believe, both civil and canon law issues. So Carlo, can you briefly summarize your work and your firm's work on that project?
Yes, well, this is one of the examples that we were talking. There's others also that are important that has been successful because we were able to preserve. The Irish College is a very old institute in Rome. It's connected with Ireland, of course. It's owned by the Irish Bishop Conference. It had up to 60 seminarians and students over the year. Of course, in the last year, all this has gone down. So for the last maybe 10, the college opened to all students from all over the world, where before was Ireland. You all know also the situation of the Irish Church in Dublin, which has been reflected. And the property is a very valuable property. We had offered for a huge mega company dealing in the hotel business, 5 stars, the biggest, that they came with offer to buy everything. And of course, this was not considered because, again, we implemented a strategy to say, what shall we do in order to protect, preserve, and continue? And this has been extremely important last year during COVID because the property is very big. And literally last year, we had 0 students because everybody had to go home because of the restriction. So we were able to use part of the college, which was the old sister, and we opened a 12 rooms pilgrim house, which is called Villa Irlanda, which is managed directly by the college. We didn't give it to our outside people, which is one of the possibilities in order to save costs and also keep control. And this is giving a good revenue because, of course, there's many Irish coming to Rome. There's many weddings that are here. There's also a number of other property that we were able to rent within the park. There's a big park. There was apartments we rented out. There's some of them that are being rented as a commercial. And therefore, this has given at least some protection on what are they covering the cost. We ask all over in Rome, which could have been the Pontifical Lateran University is very nearby, the Vicariate is very nearby, and there's been some proposal to share the space or to divide the place. And it's been a very profitable, I think, interchange of opinion. Also sometimes with technical people, but at the end, the decision which came out from a long process of duly motivated reason was approved by the superior, which of course is Dublin because it's the Bishop Conference, and they decide to keep it as it is. And as very often happens, and we forgot briefly to say this, we live on donation, we live on the support of the member of the church. And this is very much related to the visibility of what we do and how we are able to react in a difficult moment. And all this, what the Irish College did was very much appreciated. And we have Friends of the Irish College, which is a US group of association of American Irish, that they were helping the college. We received a lot of funds, a lot of support for what was the ordinary expenses, based on the fact that we were able to protect the charisma. This is a very old college, as you can imagine, it goes back 300 years ago. And it's always been there. It's in a perfect situation. It's very in the center of Rome, near the Colosseum. And any decision would not be in line with the history, would not be appreciated as the one we have today. So we were able to optimize from an income point of view with the revenue, a small part of the college with this Villa Irlanda Pilgrim House. The Pilgrim House is something that exists in Italy, is very important, and I'd like to say 2 words, because it's different from hotel. First of all, we do have some tax exemption and benefits in terms of licenses and compliance for safety and so on. Second, it attracts the so-called religious students, which is a big reality in Europe, from Spain and so on, where you actually link the accommodation with a program. You go to Mass in the morning, you go to the Holy Father on Sunday, you go on the Wednesday, you go to have a pilgrim Tours in Assisi and so on. And this is extremely successful. And it could be, I think, one of the solutions, at least here in Europe. But the other experience also we had was to divide a big another property between an Italian congregation and the Australian archdiocese. The archdiocese of Sydney didn't have really a house in Rome. Today, they have the Domus Australia, which is a reality, and was a friendly, amicable negotiation among the two orders with the cardinal involved. So we had all the hierarchy. Again, it was done with, let's say, less commercial prices. There was a discount. There was some recognition of, provided that the building was going to be used and was going to be continued. There's a big church also in this domus, which has been taken over, was originally dedicated to the Santa Maria di Pompeii, and it's been rededicated to a saint in Sydney, and the mission is continuing. The effect of this was incredible at the local level, because the entire zone here, again, in the center of Rome, appreciated. And people start to come back to the Mass because the church was closed and, of course, was totally renovated. So today is beautiful. And we have a big organ and so on. So it's really the key point, I think, in practical terms, from my experience, in conclusion, because, of course, case by case, unless we have debts, unless we need to take financial burden, is to protect what we have and optimize what we have rather than sell. It's also possible, and this we go into a peculiar, is to use the financial institution. There's many financial institutions around the world, and there will be more in the future, that they're very close to the church, and they're willing to give line of credit, to give a mortgage, perhaps, giving as a collateral one of the property, that this will again allow for a time of 5 years, 10 years, to survive and to see what happened, and to find also for other alternative solutions. And this is all a duty, as I said before, to all the temporary managing administration of the church. But then I have many other cases of restructuring the real estate asset of sister, for example. There's a big sister congregation that they had 12 schools. I personally closed 4. And we have 3 buildings empty today. We don't know what to do. The church is trying to find a solution, again, with the same process. Listening to everybody. They're all in different places here in Italy. And so we are also linking with the immigration. We're trying to link with the municipality to find a common scope in order also to continue our mission. Despite the fact that, unfortunately, this congregation of sister has a problem. There's only 70 left in the Italian province, and the youngest is 72, I think. So we are facing this type of problem. But at the same time, we're very rich. We don't have human resource, but we are very rich because the capital that they own and they produce and they preserve all this year is well known. And this opens up another consideration, which is the reputation and the image that we have to protect. Okay, right. But this, I leave this to somebody else. And great. Thank you for the moment.
Thank you, Carlo. We are starting to get some questions in the Q&A. So I have many more questions myself, but let's go to some of the Q&A from the audience. We actually have multiple questions in terms of this question of selling property and at what stage and how do we do that. So I think that's provoked some. So maybe let's start with a question. And I know prior webinars have also talked about the idea of adaptive reuse, and can we, change the use of some property, and that might involve legal issues as well. So panelists, feel free to comment on any aspect of these questions. But starting with a question from Caroline, she asks, thanks for the presentation. I am equally challenged by the choices to sell property. Are we saying that there's no turning back? There's no hope for the return of the quote unquote prodigal son? Surely maintenance is costly, but how about looking at what went wrong and fix it? So panelists, this obviously intersects with a number of issues, including the sell, lease, adopt decision, potential legal issues. So Father Pat, do you want to take a first crack at this one?
Yeah, no, Caroline, this is a beautiful question, and it, it hits my pastoral heart as I think about the ways in which so many of the houses of worship that dioceses seek to sell, to merge, so many Catholic schools that are closed and merged were once full, right? And I think your you're right to ask, like, are we in a sort of despairing disposition towards church property? I don't think so. I genuinely don't, but I think the challenge for us is one of thinking about the way in which our finite resources are stewarded well in caring for the full mission of the church and all of the people of God. So when I was in law school, I had the privilege of living with a priest who also served as the chancellor of our local archdiocese. And he would regularly say, as he was sitting on conversations about merging parishes, closing parishes, that the challenge was that all of the money that was being poured into keeping that building open, right? Even if they weren't worshiping inside, just to keep it open, to keep it safe, was money that wasn't going to their refugee resettlement program. It wasn't going to their soup kitchen. It wasn't going to helping the Catholic schools that had students in them. And there was always this balancing act between keeping the parish open for the 12 people who still worshiped there versus closing it or merging it so as to put the resources of keeping it open towards something that was working and also serving the church's mission. So I think it's a painful question, absolutely. But I think it's the same question that families ask when they're thinking about the time and the money that's invested into their children, into their spouses, balancing work and activities. For the church locally in each diocese, parish buildings, school buildings that aren't being used cost money to keep open. They cost money even to not keep open, but underutilized. And that's money that the church desperately needs for its social mission and for its sacramental mission in other parts of each diocese.
So I think also it's a wonderful question, Caroline. I would just add a couple of things. I mean, it's true, I'm sure, in all cultural contexts, but in the United States, you know, the question about can we bring it back or can we fix it, often with some assets in some places is more complex than the mistakes of the church if they're related to bigger demographic trends. So I'm passionate about Catholic education. I love the parish school. And we know in the world of Catholic education that so frequently, in order, you can bring it back. If you get a good pastor and a good principal that are really committed to Catholic education and to forming citizens of the world and eventually for forming citizens of heaven, people will come, but they have to be committed. So sometimes it's just like, let's just do a better job. Let's find the right personnel. Let's get better, evangelizing about the importance of coming to church or sending your kids to Catholic school. But I mean, downtown Detroit is not, there are a lot of problems that aren't necessarily the church's fault. And so I think we have to recognize that. I see some folks from Brownsville here. There are not that many Catholics left in downtown Detroit. There's a growing Hispanic community, and we should definitely do everything we can to serve them. But we should also think about our brothers and sisters at the border and how we're serving them, or even within a diocese, if Catholics suburbanize. So how do we think about, like, we have these assets that are like, maybe have a lot of delayed maintenance, and we're not going to bring it back, and not through really the fault of the church. I mean, the fault of, unfortunate demographic trends and immigration trends that are hopeful for the church. So I think we have to keep in mind the different situations presented by what I think is just a wonderful question. So thank you.
Great, thanks. And we have, I think, time maybe for one more question. I'm actually going to combine two and give them to Carlo, because I think, Carlo, you might be best positioned. There's two questions that both relate to sale of church property. So one of these comes from Andrew Hassan Kamara, who asks, what are some of the procedures involved in the last resort of the sale of real estate in relation to ordinary and extraordinary decision-making? And similarly, an anonymous attendee asks, in case we want to read it for ourselves or point other people to it, which canons apply to the sale/reuse of property? So Carlo, maybe you could address those questions about sale of property, and maybe just wrap it up by talking more generally about what resources are out there, whether it's law firms or people within the church. If people on the call are interested in going to get advice, who should they look for, whether force-wise or people-wise, in terms of this planning function, prudential planning, to help them?
Thank you. And I will start from this last part, because very often this is the problem. And we also have to respect that the clergy, they have a different work. They're very busy and they do their own profession very often in a very difficult situation by themselves, taking care of parish or taking care of a big community. And therefore, when we go into what we should do with this property, it's a very technical, and today there's standards. So we need to have people that are qualified. Each organization has an architect, an engineer, a lawyer, an accountant. So it's important to get together a team and see what we can do with that property. The process to alienate, it's quite simple, provided that we need to exhaust all the internal other remedies before taking a decision to sell, which is by constitution of the entity or by canon law, is to see if we can give it to somebody else within the church, even if it's not a total commercial transaction, which means even I don't get 100% of what is the commercial price. We should be open to this. Another point that Father Patrick was saying is trying to merge also the interest, because keeping property very often means expenses. We have the Agostinians in Italy, they have places in one town where they have a convent, a sanctuary, a church, a parish church, and a monastery. And perhaps the sanctuary and the monastery are abandoned. They don't even have that on the books. So it's better to put everything together under one person and do this type of work sometime in order to optimize and mitigate the expenses impact. But then the rest, how to alienate? You need to take a decision, which really by standard and by law has to be duly motivated. So provided that there's nothing else we can do, that we tried all the different reuse, change of destination, alternatives, we decide to sell. Also because, of course, we have a debt. We need to pay something. We have a liability. Okay, we need to be very accounting in this thinking. Well, you need to have a survey. What is the value of this property? Are we have this rightly on the books, or has been registered 20 years ago and the value is not correct? Well, we need to have a survey. Then who's going to buy it? Is it that in line with the church and the property, especially if there is a lien, especially if it's an historical building? Historical building also sometimes there is a first right of option by the state. So we need to offer this to the local government. And this happens in South America, happened in Italy, in Europe, everywhere. So all this has to be done with some time by a team, I think today, of people that have the capacity. And it is happening. There's many organizations like the Global Institute that we are hosted today that are helping to provide this type of advice. And internally then, of course, you need to have the decision approved at the ownership level. So if it's a congregation, you need to have the general chapter. Or maybe with the delegate, if there's been a delegate years before, the general chapter happens every 3-4 years. So if somebody has been appointed with a resolution, you have to draft the resolution for transparency, and not just I appoint Father Patrick to sell. We have to say why, which are the power, which are the prices. Mention that we have a survey that is €1 million of value. Then if we go over the minimum, we have to go also to the hierarchic authority of the church. Therefore, we need to have the nil obstat. Each bishop conference all over the world, they establish which is the minimum below which you don't need the nil obstat. But very often when you're dealing with property, you need to get also the authorization from the congregation, competent congregation. And if you're a diocese, you go to the bishop at the diocese. Or if you're pontifical, you have to come to Rome and get the authorization from the congregation here of the Holy See. This takes time. And again, there is a guarantee that all this process, one is completed, it brings you in good faith, for especially those who are dealing with the decision, that you're doing the right thing for the church. So this is my experience, this is my advice.
We are out of time. We're actually over time, but I think that's just an indication of how many issues there are. I saw one other question in the Q&A about whether canon law or civil law principles apply or take precedence. And I think I can say fairly certain, although correct me if I'm wrong, that in all of these transactions and property issues, both apply. So it's good to both comply with canon law and also civil law at the same time. So I know that's very general advice, but Pia, I will send it back to you. But thank you so much for everyone today for participating. We look forward, hopefully this is just the start. We look forward to many more, not only webinars, but in-person conferences and meetings and interactions with all of you, because there's so much potential here for the church. Church is very land rich and real estate rich, but often cash poor. So figuring out how to do that and use those assets in a way that is consistent with our history, meets current needs, and also helps the church going forward is a very difficult job, but I think there are ways to do it. So Pia, with that, I send it back to you.
Thank you, Dan, very much for moderating the panel today. And I want to thank all of our panelists. This is a very rich conversation. Clearly one we could probably turn into a whole series in and of itself. For resources, I just want to underscore first the Fitzgerald Institute for Real Estate as a resource. They are continuing to gather lots of information, particularly on best practices. It's one of the things that I've enjoyed is just learning about all of the creative uses and of real estate and repurposing it in line with the church's goal, which is the salvation of souls. So this has been, I think it's exciting, and I really recommend the Fitzgerald Institute for Real Estate as a resource. For the hard skills, come to us. That's Program of Church Management in Rome, where we have our certificate program. And then we have the intensive sessions, the executive intensive sessions twice during the year. And we're in the process of establishing partnerships with other institutions around the globe. So hopefully in the next year or two, we'll be able to offer these courses more locally and even online. Just want to remind you of a couple of dates. Our next webinar is going to be on innovative financing, because in our first webinar, it was very clear that the first thing we need to do is help people come up with how to finance these great projects. Sometimes the cash is not readily available. So that will be on Thursday, January 13th, same local time for you. And we'll be publishing that information. Again, the conference with FIRE has been postponed from February to April. Our tentative dates are the 28th through the 30th of April in Rome. And looking forward to confirming that and getting the word out there. Again, you can register for that for more information on our website at gicm.org. And we will be posting these videos. I know I've been promising that all along. I've added to our staff. So hopefully with the new year coming, we'll be seeing the videos posted, and we'll be posting them on a more current basis. So again, want to thank you for all of your time today, the time of our experts and all of our participants. And as always, I'm available if you have any questions, suggestions, comments. It's great to hear from you. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you very much to everybody.
God bless.
Thanks, everyone. Happy Advent. Merry Christmas.